Hey everyone, it's your friendly neighborhood Lamberman here. Welcome back to another weekly VR wrap-up. Now this is going to be a video that covers some of the highlights and news from the last week in VR. Now last week was a bit of a quieter week compared to the week before. That week was CES and there was a ton of stuff that came out that week. Last week was a bit quieter, everybody was kind of recovering from all the awesome stuff that happened, but there was still some big things that came out. Most notably had to do with the movie Jumanji. Now earlier this week they released a Jumanji VR tie-in game on Steam VR, and well, let's just say it's not very good at all. Now movie tie-ins have never really had the best of reputations, aside from the odd few that have actually been really good surprisingly, but this kind of sets a new low, I would say. The game released to very little fanfare. It just sort of popped up on Steam one day. Some people found it and shared it on Reddit, and then a few hours later it was gone from the store, but then it came back sometime later and it's still there to this day. You can still buy it now, but if you look at the video of it, it's atrocious. It's like half-baked would be a compliment for this game. It doesn't look even close to being finished. It's just generally terrible graphics, very basic gameplay. I know we have seen some pretty bad VR experiences over the last few years, but at this stage, after VR has been with us as a consumer product for about 2 years, you'd think that they would actually put a lot more effort into a VR experience. Sony have had some relatively decent VR experiences in the past. They've had the Spider-Man one, which while short was very polished. They had a Passengers VR experience, which was by the same developers as the Jumanji one, but even that, I never really heard much about it, but even that looks a lot better than this as well. So I don't know what happened with this one. This is probably why the release flew under the radar so much. They kind of just pushed it out there, knowing that it was going to get a ton of bad press. Not really sure what happened there. Apparently Sony is still planning to release the game on Rift and PlayStation VR later this year, but whether they actually go through with that, considering all the bad press the game has been getting, I'm not sure. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Maybe they will just try and throw it out there just to get some money back from their investment. I don't really know. Now this is where things start to get really strange, is that Sony is planning to release this game in VR arcades all over the world, and they've teamed up with Survios to do this. Now Survios is the developers of games such as Raw Data and the forthcoming Sprint Vector, both of which are very, very polished games, and Survios is regarded as one of the premier VR studios out there. So it's very bizarre to see their name attached to this. From what I can tell, Survios is only doing the actual distribution of the game to the arcades. They haven't really had anything to do with the game aside from that, which kind of makes sense because, you know, if they had actually worked on the game itself, they undoubtedly would have made it look better. So yeah, they're partnered with Sony to distribute it to the VR arcades, and because they're not really too involved with the game, hopefully none of the bad press from the game rubs off on them. Probably won't, considering their own products are so much better. But it's kind of a very, very strange tasting icing on the cake for what was an already bizarre situation. Of all the studios I expected to be attached to a dumpster fire such as this, Survios was nowhere near that list. Speaking of Survios, the studio recently announced a closed beta for their upcoming game Sprint Vector. Now the beta actually started on the weekend and it goes until next weekend. It's a closed beta, so if you want to join it you have to sign up. I'll put a link to the sign up form in the description down below. Now they've already sent out a batch of keys. They'll be sending out another batch of keys later in the week, which fingers crossed I'll get a key in it because I would love to give that game a run through its paces on a Windows mixed reality headset, just to see how well it goes. Now what's cool about the game is that it uses a sort of running in place locomotion. That's where you move your arms like this to move around. What it does is that it does that at super crazy speeds. So the game's all about, well, it's all about running and racing in all these crazy environments. So it'll be single player, it'll be multiplayer. The multiplayer in the closed beta will be only at certain times during the 10 days, but it's shaping up to be a pretty cool looking game, and it's one of the ones that I'm looking forward to the most for in 2018. Now let's get right back over to some bizarre news, and that's that we're going to be seeing Nicolas Cage in VR pretty soon. Yeah, He kind of disappeared off the face of Hollywood for a while there, but is kind of making his comeback now. Now this is for a new movie of his called The Humanity Bureau. Now the Humanity Bureau itself is a dystopian futuristic movie where he's playing an agent who decides who does and doesn't deserve to be in the new civilization that humanity is building. So he's the guy in charge of that, ends up meeting a girl, things fall apart, ends up on the run from the government, etc., etc. It's pretty standard fare. It sounds interesting though. But what they're doing is that they're going to be doing a sort of a spin-off web series of the movie, which is going to be a 360 video. So it's going to be broken up into multiple episodes. It'll run parallel to the film story. But it's kind of cool to see more studios trying out the 360 video. Now the reason they went for episodic content instead of the actual film itself in VR was because it's a lot easier to watch shorter videos in VR. It's not that great to be watching a feature-length film in VR right now. I mean, I don't have any issues with it personally. A lot of other people do find it a bit annoying right now. So yeah, they've broken it up into a web series essentially, which should be releasing sometime around the time of the movie's release. So they've said that it's going to be 360 video. What they haven't said yet is if it's also going to be stereoscopic. A lot of 360 videos are just like a flat 360. It looks like a video projected onto a giant dome around you. Stereoscopic is where you got an image for each eye, and so you can see everything with some proper depth. So there hasn't been any announcement of what it's going to be. If I had to guess, it probably would just be flat 360. I would like it to be stereoscopic because I don't really get the appeal of flat 360 videos. Plus they get to announce what platforms the web series is actually going to be on. If it's going to be on like YouTube or if it's going to be on Vimeo or what other platforms there are out there. So there's been no word on that either. But hopefully it's available on as many VR headsets as possible. I don't really have high hopes for the movie itself, but you know, any well-produced content is good content in my opinion. Just to get the word out there about VR. Keeping on the theme of bizarre news, because apparently this week was pretty full of it, we're gonna talk about VR's most bizarre app, VRChat. Yeah, this is a very, very special game. It's basically a big social VR program, kind of like Altspace VR and other social VR apps before it. The main thing about this is that it has a ton of user-generated content. Players can create their own avatars in Unity and whatever 3D animation programs and then upload them. Same for creating their own worlds. So you have a lot of people running around as all these different characters from different franchises. Most notably, this very little, fat, distorted Knuckles character. And they've formed a tribe called the Ugandan Knuckles. If you haven't heard of the Ugandan Knuckles meme, I would suggest searching for it on YouTube. There's like a million videos out there. It's very, very strange. But the game has been going really well, and this week it surpassed 2 million installs. Now that sounds like a lot for a Steam VR game, considering there's probably only just over 1 million Steam VR headsets out there. But what the developers did with this game is, it's called VRChat, but you can still actually play without a VR headset. Because all it really is, it's just social, it's just chatting with people. So, you know, keyboard, mouse, they made it work with that kind of setup. So they made it for VR, they made it for non-VR, they made it free as well. And the popularity of it on YouTube, it's just been growing tremendously because it is essentially just a meme machine. It's a user-generated meme machine. So because of that, it's seen a tremendous amount of success. Like I said, it hit 2 million installs this week. It also hit 20,000 concurrent players on January the 14th, which put it in the top 30 most played games for that day. That's like out of all the games on Steam, not just VR games, it's VR and non-VR. So that was very impressive, and I think that's probably the highest a VR game has ever gotten on Steam. As of this video, it's now down at about 56th for today. It hit about 12,000 concurrent players. But funnily enough, and this keeps in with this week's theme of bizarre, is that that was more popular than Call of Duty World War II. So I think that has to say more about Call of Duty's general popularity on PC than VRChat itself. But yeah, that's kind of where it's ranking right now in Steam popularity. So despite the fact that it's VR and non-VR, the fact that it is called VRChat, and that generally when you're in the game, if you don't have a VR headset, you're kind of classed as a second-class citizen almost. It is really, really pushing the popularity of VR right now. It's one of these cases where there's hype about VR content, not just the hardware itself. So as strange as all the memes are that are coming out of the game, it is doing quite a lot of good for the VR industry. So I'm quite happy with the success that it's been hitting recently. And lastly for this week, Onward has announced a free weekend for this upcoming weekend. So Onward is a 5v5 military sim type game, and it's been one of the most popular VR multiplayer games over the last, I think it's almost like a year and a half now it's been out. Last year it released on the Oculus Rift, and so now it's on pretty much every VR headset out there. You can play it on Rift, you can play it on Vive, you can play it on Windows Mixed Reality. And this free weekend that's coming up will give those who haven't yet played the game a chance to actually try it out and see what it's like. It's a pretty decent multiplayer game. It's very fun to play in VR. It kind of popularized the whole smooth locomotion you see right now, which is where you use like the joystick or the thumb pad on your controller combined with the direction of your controller to determine your movements. So it was kind of the game that popularized that, made people realize that, hey, we don't actually have to teleport around everywhere. Some people can handle smooth movement. So if you want to see where that all started, it's from this game. Free weekend looks like it's going to be a bunch of fun. Hopefully it should bump up the user base a little bit, because while it is one of the more successful and more popular multiplayer VR games, as per any VR multiplayer game, the amount of players is generally lowish. So I'm just hoping that there's a lot of Australian players that jump on so I can actually play against some people with a decent ping. But yeah, it's a pretty fun game. I would give it a try if you haven't already. Mark it down in your calendars. It goes from January the 25th to the 29th. And yeah, so it'll be free to play during that weekend. You don't get to keep it after the weekend though. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Anyway, that's the VR news for this week. It's been a quiet week, like I said, but it's also been a kind of bizarre week. Here's hoping that this week is a return to sanity for the VR news in general. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This is part of a series that I'm doing, which is like a weekly roundup of the biggest VR news and highlights. So if you want to see more of this, I would suggest hitting that subscribe button down below. I'm also doing gameplays and tests of VR games on this channel, predominantly for Windows Mixed Reality, on the occasion like a mega review of games on like all the VR platforms they're available on. So I'm planning on doing more of those in the future, and yeah, just a lot of general VR fun stuff. Anyway, that's all from me for today. So again, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.